The smell hit her like a fist to the chest. Esther Alden stood frozen in the doorway of Paul Blackwell's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October of 1878, and the world she had constructed around herself, the careful, brick-by-brick wall of distance and survival she had built over 17 years, came apart in the space of a single breath. Cinnamon, brown sugar. The low, rolling scent of something simmering in cast iron, something with dried apple and clove and just a trace of wood smoke underneath it all. The exact smell. The impossible, heartbreaking, sacred smell of her mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning in Virginia when Esther had been 8 years old, and the world had still been soft around the edges. Her knees nearly buckled. She grabbed the doorframe with one hand, and the tin cup she was carrying rattled against the wood. And Paul, who was standing at the iron stove with his back to her, turned around with the casual ease of a man who had no idea he had just destroyed something and rebuilt it at the same time. "Coffee's fresh," he said, like nothing was wrong. Like the entire axis of her existence had not just shifted 3 degrees to the left. Esther could not speak. She was breathing through her nose deliberately, trying to measure the smell, trying to determine whether it was a trick of her exhausted mind, whether the dry Kansas wind had carried something in from somewhere that had confused her senses. But no, it was real. It was undeniable and real, and she had not felt anything like it since the morning before her mother died, since the last Sunday they had ever had together, since the last time the world had felt like a place that might actually hold her. "Miss Alden," Paul set down the wooden spoon he was holding, his brow furrowed. He had dark eyes, the kind that picked up detail quickly, the kind she had been carefully avoiding for the 3 weeks she had been living in the boarding house across the road from his property. "You look like you've seen something. What are you cooking?" Her voice came out strange, scraped thin. He looked at the pot. "Apple preserves with cinnamon, old recipe from my grandmother. I put them up every fall before the first frost." He paused. "It's nothing special, nothing special." Esther pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to get control of whatever was rising dangerously in her throat, and then she lowered her hand and made herself look at him directly for what might have been the first time since she had arrived in Hays City, Kansas. "It smells like my mother's kitchen," she said. The words cost her something considerable. Paul Blackwell did not say something foolish. He did not reach for her or offer hollow comfort. He simply nodded once, like he understood that some things do not need a response, and he turned back to the stove and said, "Then you'd better come in and sit down." And something in Esther Alden, who had not felt at home since childhood, cracked open like dry earth after a long rain. But she had not always been this woman standing in a Kansas doorway, struggling to breathe through the grief she had outrun for 17 years. To understand how Esther arrived at Paul Blackwell's kitchen on that October morning, you have to go back 3 months, to the late summer dust of a Kansas City train platform, and to the letter that had started all of it. She had been 25 years old when she answered the advertisement. It had appeared in a Philadelphia newspaper that she had been using mostly to wrap her few possessions before moving from one boarding house to another. The advertisement had been neat and formal, the kind composed by a man who chose words carefully. It had read, "Widower in Hays City, Kansas seeks a woman of practical temperament and honest character to serve as housekeeper and potential wife. Property is established. Situation is stable. No romantics need apply. Contact Paul Blackwell, Hays City, Kansas territory." The part that had caught her was not the practical temperament. It was the last line. No romantics need apply. Esther had not been a romantic since she was 8 years old. She had written back the same day. Their correspondence had lasted 4 months, through the late spring and the heat of summer. Paul's letters were brief, factual, and oddly calming to read. He told her about his property, a cattle operation of modest size on the western edge of Hays City. He told her that he had a foreman named Amos Greer who handled the daily running of the cattle, and that he himself managed the land records, the contracts, and what he called the business side of ranching. He told her that his wife, Clara, had died in the winter of 1876 of typhoid fever, and that the house had been without a woman's management for nearly 2 years and had suffered for it. He did not speak of grief. He did not speak of loneliness. He spoke of logistics. Esther had found this deeply comforting. She told him in return that she was from Virginia originally, that her parents had both died when she was young, that she had been educated in Philadelphia through the charity of a distant aunt who had herself died in 1872, and that she had spent the subsequent years working as a seamstress and occasional governess. She did not tell him what she had lost. She did not tell him about the specific texture of the grief that followed her everywhere like a second shadow. She told him she was capable, healthy, and had no attachments in Philadelphia that would prevent her from relocating. She told him she was not a romantic. He had written back within 2 weeks and asked her to come. The train journey from Philadelphia to Kansas City had taken her through landscapes that changed so dramatically and so steadily that she had felt, by the time she reached the Missouri River, like she was traveling not just in distance, but in kind, like the very nature of the world was being revised around her. The crowded, vertical, brick-faced world of the eastern cities gave way to something horizontal and enormous, something that seemed to have no ceiling, and Esther had pressed her face to the window of the railcar and felt the particular vertigo of open space, meeting a person who had spent years keeping herself very, very small. From Kansas City, she had taken a second train west to Hays City on the Kansas Pacific Railway, which had arrived in Hays City in 1867 and had made it, in the years since, a cattle shipping center of some rough importance. The train had deposited her on a platform in the early evening of a hot August day, and the town that surrounded her had been simultaneously smaller and louder than she had expected. Wooden storefronts, a wide main street with more mud than she had anticipated, the smell of cattle and dust, and the particular sharp scent of raw lumber that meant the town was still in the process of becoming whatever it intended to be. She had looked for Paul Blackwell on the platform, and he had not been there. Instead, she had found a handwritten note folded and pinned to the platform's support post, addressed to Miss E. Alden in precise letters. She had opened it with careful fingers. It had said, "Miss Alden, I was called to the county land office this morning on a matter that could not be deferred. I have arranged for a room at Mrs. Halloran's boarding house on Front Street, 2nd floor, first door on the left. It is paid through the month. I will call on you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I am sorry for the poor welcome. P. Blackwell." The apology at the end had surprised her. She had not expected him to apologize. She had read it twice, folded it, and walked to Mrs. Halloran's boarding house, which was a 2-story frame building with a narrow porch and curtains in every window that suggested someone cared a great deal about the appearance of domestic order. Paul had come the next morning at exactly 9 o'clock. She had heard his boots on the steps before he knocked, a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. She had opened the door, and they had regarded each other for a moment in the way of people who have written many words to each other, and now must reconcile those words with an actual face. He was taller than she had imagined, lean through the shoulders, but with the kind of physical solidity that came from outdoor labor rather than display. He was 31, dark-haired, with the particular look of a man who had spent significant portions of his life squinting against the sun. His face was not conventionally handsome, but it was deeply readable, and what she read in it at that first moment was a measured, cautious kind of attention. He was looking at her the way you look at a contract before you sign it, not with suspicion exactly, but with the honest intention of understanding what you were agreeing to. "Miss Alden," he said. "Mr. Blackwell," she said. "How was the journey?" "Long," she said, "but manageable." He nodded like this was exactly the right answer. "I thought we might take a walk and I can show you the town before we discuss the arrangement in any detail. I find it easier to talk while moving." "So do I," Esther said, which was true. Stillness had always made difficult conversations harder. They had walked the length of Front Street and back, and Paul had pointed out the useful establishments in a tone that was informative without being condescending. The general store run by a man named Calloway, the post office, the doctor's practice, which he mentioned twice, which she later understood was because medical care was not something to be taken lightly out here. The church, which was a modest frame building at the north end of the street that served on Sundays for the Protestant congregation, a land office, 2 saloons, which he mentioned without commentary, the livery stable where he kept a horse for her use if she chose. "You arranged a horse for me," she said. "You said in your 3rd letter that you had ridden since you were 12, he said. "I assumed you'd want the option." She had said that. The fact that he had remembered and acted on it settled something in her that had been quietly uncertain since she had arrived. He was a man who listened. That was not nothing. He showed her his property on the 2nd day. The cattle operation sat approximately 2 miles south of Hays City proper, a spread of 340 acres that ran along a creek, which Paul told her was called Smoky Hill Tributary, and which ran more generously than most creeks in this part of the state. The house was a substantial 2-story frame structure, white painted though the paint was beginning to weather, with a wide porch and a kitchen garden at the side that had gone somewhat wild in the 2 years since Clara's death. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse where Amos Greer and 2 hired hands lived. The house had good bones, Esther thought immediately, standing in the kitchen and looking at the wide cast-iron stove and the deep sink with its pump handle and the shelves that ran the length of the south wall. It was dusty and impractical in its current state, with tools where they did not belong and food stores mixed without any organizing logic, but the structure of it was sound. The structure of it said, someone once knew how to make this work, and with the right attention it could work again. "I need to be honest with you about what the position entails," Paul said, standing in the kitchen doorway. He had a way of standing in doorways, she noticed. Like he was not quite ready to commit to the room. "The house needs significant work to restore it to proper management. I'm not asking you to be a servant. I'm asking you to be a partner in running this household. That's different." "How is it different?" she asked, not provocatively. She genuinely wanted to know. "A servant takes orders," he said. "A partner makes decisions. If you see something that needs doing, you do it. If you have an opinion about how something should be run, I want to hear it. Clara ran this house, and I only ever understood about a quarter of what she did to keep it running. I'd like to not make that mistake again." There was something in the way he said Clara's name, not with the theatrical grief she had seen some widowers perform, but with a plain, private kind of acknowledgement, like someone naming a fact that mattered to them, that told her he had been genuinely good to his wife, that he had valued her in practical daily ways. That was more meaningful to Esther than any declaration he could have made. "I can manage this house," she said. "I'll need a week to assess it and make a list of what's needed." "Take whatever time you need," he said. The formal arrangement they settled on was this. Esther would serve as the housekeeper of the Blackwell property, managing the domestic operations of the house. She would receive room, board, and a small monthly wage. The question of marriage was left, by mutual unspoken agreement, in a category of things to be revisited later. Neither of them were people who could be hurried into something as consequential as that. They were, in the careful and deliberate parlance of their correspondence, taking things one step at a time. Esther moved into the house at the beginning of September. She took the corner room on the 2nd floor, which had a window that looked south over the creek. For the first several days she did exactly what she had said she would. She assessed. She made lists. She walked through every room and every storage space and the kitchen garden and the small root cellar, and she cataloged what was present, what was absent, what was broken, what was merely neglected. The process of it was enormously satisfying to her in a way that was difficult to articulate. She had always been this way, had always found deep comfort in the act of imposing order on chaos, in understanding the structure of a thing before trying to change it. Paul left her largely alone during this period, which she appreciated. He came and went at hours that suited the business of the ranch, and they shared meals at the kitchen table in the evenings, and the conversation at those meals was mostly about practical matters. The state of the root cellar, the garden's potential for late-season vegetables, the supply situation at Callaway's general store. He asked good questions and accepted her answers without trying to revise them, and she found, cautiously and with some residual surprise, that she did not dread those evening meals. But there were moments that she worked hard to root around the inside of herself, because she was not a romantic and she had not come here for that, and she was not going to complicate a practical arrangement with feelings she had no particular confidence in. The first moment happened in the second week. She had been in the kitchen garden, pulling up the overgrown mess that remained of what had once clearly been a well-tended plot, and she had uncovered, under a sprawl of dead vines, a row of late-blooming marigolds that were somehow still alive and still orange against all the brown. She had sat back on her heels and stared at them with something that was half surprise and half an emotion she did not have a clean name for, and Paul had come around the corner of the house at that exact moment and stopped when he saw her sitting in the dirt among the marigolds, and the expression that crossed his face was quick and private and gone before she could fully read it. "Clara planted those," he said quietly. "I didn't know they were still there." "I'll leave them," Esther said. He shook his head. "You don't have to. The garden is yours to work with." "I'll leave them anyway," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that careful, reading look of his, and then he nodded and walked on, and Esther turned back to the marigolds and sat with them for another few minutes in the late afternoon sun. The second moment happened at the end of September. She had been up before dawn because a cold front had come through in the night, and she was concerned about the root cellar, and she had gone down to check the stores and found, to her relief, that everything was intact. Coming back up through the kitchen, she had found Paul already awake and standing at the back door with a cup of coffee, looking out at the prairie in the gray pre-dawn, and the sight of him in that particular stillness, not posed, not performing, just a man standing in his house in the early dark looking at the land he had built his life around, had hit her somewhere under the ribs with a force she had not expected. She had coughed deliberately to announce herself, because walking up behind a man who did not know you were there was how you got shot in Kansas in 1878, and also because she needed the half-second of noise to compose her face. He had turned and looked at her without surprise. "Root cellar all right. Everything's fine," she said. He had handed her his coffee cup without being asked, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she had taken it and stood beside him, and they had watched the sky go from black to gray to a deep bruised pink over the flat line of the horizon, and neither of them had said anything else, and it had been, Esther thought afterward, the most at ease she had felt in Kansas since her arrival. But it was the apple preserves that broke her open. That Tuesday in October, she had sat at Paul's kitchen table and let herself cry for the first time in 17 years. Not dramatically. Not with the heaving grief she had been carrying all that time. Just quietly, with her hands folded in her lap and the tears running down her face without her particularly choosing them, while the smell of cinnamon and brown sugar and dried apple filled the kitchen, and the sound of Paul's wooden spoon stirring against the cast iron pot made a rhythm like something remembered. Paul did not say anything for a long time. He let her cry. He kept stirring, because the preserves needed tending, and the fact that he did not abandon the practical thing to come and flutter over her was somehow exactly right. When she had stopped, she wiped her face with the hem of her apron and said, "My mother made preserves every fall, apple with cinnamon and brown sugar. I can still remember the way the kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings when she put them up. I haven't been able to remember it this clearly in years." "When did she pass?" Paul asked. "I was 8, Esther said. "She died in November of 1861. My father followed her the next spring. We were in Virginia. The war made everything harder." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was the kind of sorry that meant something, not the reflexive kind. "It was a long time ago," she said. Then she amended herself because she was in the habit of honesty. It feels longer in some directions than in others. He set down the wooden spoon and turned to face her fully, leaning against the counter with his arms folded. You've been carrying that a long time on your own. Most people carry their losses on their own, she said. Yes, he said. But some people have somewhere to put them down, a place that feels like home, a person who makes that feel possible. He paused. You haven't had that. The way he said it, not as a question and not as pity, but as a simple recognition of a fact he had been quietly observing for weeks, undid something in her that she had not known was still holding itself together. No, she said, I haven't. He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her at the table, not beside her, not in a way that would crowd her, across where she could see his face clearly and he could see hers. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to tell me the honest answer even if it's not the one you think I want. All right, she said. Do you want to stay, not because of the arrangement? Not because it's practical or because you don't have somewhere else to go, because you want to be here. The kitchen smelled like her mother's. The October light was coming through the window over the sink and laying itself in a long stripe across the floor. Paul's hands were folded on the table, the hands of a man who worked hard and worked honestly, and he was looking at her with all the careful, reading attention he always brought to things that mattered to him. Yes, Esther said. And she meant it in every sense of the word. The weeks that followed that Tuesday were different. Not dramatically, not with some sudden transformation that would have alarmed them both. They were too sensible for that, too accustomed to moving carefully. But the difference was real. The air between them had changed. The formality that had been serving as useful scaffolding had begun, slowly and then more quickly, to come down. She started calling him Paul. He had been calling her Esther since the first week, because he was not a man who maintained distance through titles when it did not serve any purpose, and she had liked hearing her name in his voice while carefully not admitting that she liked it. Calling him Paul in return was a small thing that was also not small at all. They began eating breakfast together as well as dinner. This had not been part of any arrangement. It began one morning when she came down to the kitchen early and found him already there, and instead of the half-acknowledgement and separate routines of the previous weeks, she simply went to the stove and made eggs for both of them, and he set out 2 cups and 2 plates, and they sat down together like it was something they had always done. He told her things now. Not all at once, not with the confessional urgency of a man who had been waiting to unburden himself. But gradually, in the way of someone who had decided to trust a person and was finding the decision to be a good one. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father who had been a farmer and his mother who had died when he was 16 of a fever that swept through their county in the summer of 1863. He told her that he had come to Kansas in 1870 with $47 and a determination to build something that was his, that could not be taken away, that would outlast whatever the weather and the market and the general indifference of the universe might throw at it. He told her about building the house with his own hands and 2 hired men over the summer of 1871, about meeting Clara Whitfield at a church social in Hays City that autumn, about proposing to her with a ring he had made himself from a silver coin because he could not yet afford a proper one. He told her about Clara without being asked, and she listened without flinching, because she understood that a person's past loves were not competition but context. Clara had been 32 when the typhoid took her. They had been married 5 years. They had lost a baby in 1875, a boy who had been born too early and had not lived. The typhoid had come for Clara the following winter, and Paul had nursed her for 3 weeks with everything he had before she left him, and he had been alone since then, and the house had been quiet in ways that he had not always known how to navigate. You never thought to sell and go back east? Esther asked one evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper and the sky over the prairie was doing the thing it did out here that she was beginning to love, that enormous western sky putting on colors that no eastern sky she had ever seen could compete with. No, he said without hesitation. This is mine. I built it. I'm not a person who leaves a thing he's built. He glanced at her sideways. Are you? She thought about Philadelphia, about the 17 years of careful, provisional living, of never letting herself settle because settling implied a place worth settling in and she had not found one. She thought about the walls she had built, one brick at a time, and whether she was the kind of person who was capable of taking them down. I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I think I might not be. I think I might be a person who wants to stay somewhere. He looked at her for a moment with the specific attention she had come to recognize as his version of tenderness, the particular quality of his gaze when he was feeling something he was not yet ready to put into words. Then he looked back at the sky. Good, he said. But not everything was quiet and careful and gradual, because this was Kansas in 1878, and the West was not a place that allowed people to build their lives without interruption. The trouble arrived in the form of Harlan Greer, who was Amos Greer's younger brother, who rode into Hays City on a Thursday in late October with two men she had never seen before, and a story that Paul told her about that evening with a tight jaw and careful words. Harlan Greer had been working cattle drives through Texas and Oklahoma for the past several years, and he had arrived in Hays City with a claim that complicated everything. He said that Amos owed him money, a substantial sum from a business arrangement several years prior, and that if Amos could not pay, he was prepared to go to the county court and make claims on any property Amos had a stake in. The problem was that Amos Greer had a verbal agreement with Paul that included a small ownership stake in the Blackwell operation, a stake that Paul had offered as part of Amos's compensation 3 years ago when he could not afford to pay him full wages. It had never been formally documented, which means, Paul said, that if Harlan can convince a judge that Amos's share is actually his by right of debt, I could lose effective control of a portion of my own land in court. Esther set down her fork. Does the verbal agreement count for anything? In an honest court, yes, but courts out here are not always honest courts. He was quiet for a moment. I need to go to the land office first thing tomorrow and find a lawyer who knows property law. Is Amos trustworthy? She asked. This was the important question. Paul did not hesitate. Amos is the most honest man I've ever employed. He's been with me 6 years. Whatever debt Harlan is claiming, I'd stake this property on the fact that Amos's accounting of it is the right one. Then the first thing, Esther said, is to sit down with Amos tonight and get every detail of the original arrangement written down. Dates, amounts, terms, everything he can remember. And you should write down your own accounts separately before you talk to each other so that there are 2 independent records that can be compared. Paul looked at her across the table. That's exactly right. I can help you write the documents, she said. I have a clear hand and I know how to structure a record. I used to help my employer in Philadelphia with his accounts. He nodded slowly. I didn't know that. There are things I haven't told you yet, she said, and the word yet sat in the air between them with a specific weight that neither of them addressed directly. They spent the evening with Amos Greer at the kitchen table, writing careful, detailed accounts of the original arrangement, dated and witnessed by Esther as a third party. Amos was a quiet man in his 40s, broad through the chest, with the specific dignity of someone who knew his own worth and did not feel the need to advertise it. He was clearly troubled by his brother's arrival, not frightened exactly, but carrying the particular strain of a man who had worked hard to build something clean and now saw dirty hands reaching for it. Harlan's been trouble his whole life, Amos said quietly, when they had finished the documents. I didn't know he was coming here. If I had, I'd have warned you sooner. It's not your fault your brother is your brother, Paul said. We'll handle it. The handling of it took the better part of 2 weeks and involved Paul making 3 trips to the county seat at Ellsworth, where a lawyer named Edward Marsh agreed to represent his interests. Esther managed the ranch house during Paul's absences with a focus and efficiency that she had not known she possessed at this scale. And she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not merely function during those days but genuinely engaged with the work, genuinely cared about its outcome in a way that had nothing to do with her own security, and everything to do with the fact that she had come to care about what happened to this particular piece of land, and the man who had built something on it. The days Paul was away were the days she realized, with the specific clarity that loneliness brings, that she had fallen in love with him. It arrived not as a revelation but as a recognition. She had been circling this knowledge for weeks, and the circling had been its own answer. She had been cutting dried herbs in the kitchen one afternoon when she understood it fully. She had been standing at the table with bundles of the last rosemary and thyme from the kitchen garden, and she had been thinking about Paul on the road to Ellsworth, and she had thought, "I hope he is warm enough." And the simplicity and depth of that thought, the specific quality of the care in it, had told her everything she needed to know. She wrote him a letter that evening which she folded and did not send, because she was not going to send a letter to a man on a legal trip telling him she had discovered she loved him. She was practical, not impulsive, but writing it down helped. It was the first honest accounting of the thing, and it helped her carry it properly. Paul returned from Ellsworth on a Friday evening looking tired in the way of someone who has been dealing with systems that do not always want to cooperate, but with a steadiness in his face that told her the news was not catastrophic. They sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and he laid it out. Edward Marsh had reviewed the situation and was confident that the verbal agreement, supported by the written accounts they had prepared, combined with 6 years of Amos's employment records, was sufficient to defend against Harlan's claim. Furthermore, Marsh had discovered that Harlan's so-called business arrangement with Amos had involved a cattle deal from 1874 that was already legally settled by a bill of sale Amos had retained. Harlan's claim was largely manufactured. "Marsh thinks Harlan knew it was weak," Paul said. "He was counting on Amos not having documentation, and on you not being the sort of man who keeps careful records," Esther added. "Fortunately for me," he said quietly, "I have someone who understands the value of documentation." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was throwing a warm light, and outside the October night had gone cold and clear, and somewhere far off she could hear the particular silence of the prairie, which was not true silence but a layered, breathing kind of quiet. She thought about the letter she had written and not sent. "Paul," she said. "Esther," he said. They said each other's names at the same time, which was not something either of them had planned, and the small coincidence of it hung in the air, and then, for the first time in all the weeks they had been navigating careful spaces around each other, they both smiled. Not politely. Actually smiled, the kind that reaches the eyes and means something has relaxed. "You go first," he said. "I wanted to say," she began, and then paused because she was not practiced at this and she needed to find the words that were true. "I wanted to say that I have found, since coming here, that I am not the same person I was in Philadelphia. I do not mean that I have changed in ways I don't recognize. I mean the opposite. I mean I feel more like myself than I have in many years, and I think," she stopped, looked at her hands, looked up at him, "I think that is something to do with you." Paul was quiet for a moment that felt very long and also somehow not long enough. "I have a thing to say as well," he said, "if you'll let me." "Say it," she said. "I have been careful," he said, "about everything in my life. I built this house carefully. I built this business carefully. I chose Clara carefully, and I was careful in loving her. And when I lost her, I was careful about my grief because the alternative was to let it take everything. And I couldn't let it take everything because there was too much that depended on me." He paused. "I have been careful about you, Esther. I have been very deliberate about not rushing this or asking more than was fair. But I think I would be doing us both a disservice if I was careful about this any longer." She held still. "I am in love with you," he said, simply, directly, without theater. "I believe I have been for some time. I would like to know if that is a thing you can meet me in." Outside, the prairie breathed its cold, dark breath. The lamp flickered once. Somewhere in the bunkhouse Amos Greer was reading a book or writing a letter to someone, and the 2 hired hands were playing cards, and the horses were settled in the barn, and all of this small, specific, actual world had gathered itself around her in the kitchen doorway on a Tuesday morning when the smell of cinnamon hit her like a fist and a gift at the same time. "I wrote you a letter," Esther said. "This week while you were away, I didn't send it." "What did it say?" "It said that I was in love with you," she said, "and that it scared me. And that I was going to feel it anyway because the alternative was to spend the rest of my life being careful, and I am tired of being careful." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his, and it was the first time he had touched her with intent rather than accident, and his hands were warm and large and calloused and absolutely real, and she turned her hand over in his and held on. "We could stop being so careful," he said. "We could try," she agreed. He had not kissed her that night. That was for later, for a Sunday 2 weeks hence that began with frost on the grass and ended with the two of them standing in the kitchen in the last light of the afternoon, very close together, until the distance between them ran out entirely and was replaced by something better. When he did kiss her, it was the way he did everything, with attention and intention, with the particular quality of a man who does not do things halfway. She had kissed him back with everything she had been holding for 17 years, and it had been, she thought afterward, more like coming home than any physical place had ever been. But first there was November to navigate, and November brought its own complications. The first was Harlan Greer, who did not take the legal rebuff quietly. Marsh had sent him a formal response through the county court in late October that effectively dismissed his claim, and Harlan had ridden through Hayes City in the first week of November drunk and loud, and had said things in the saloon about Paul Blackwell and his woman that reached Esther's ears through the particular efficiency of small-town information transfer before they reached Paul's. She was in Calloway's general store when she heard it secondhand from Mrs. Calloway, who had the grace to look uncomfortable repeating it but who clearly felt Esther had the right to know. What Harlan had said was that Paul Blackwell had brought an Eastern woman to run his house who was of questionable character, that the arrangement had no legitimacy, and that Paul himself was a man who thought he was better than he was. Esther had thanked Mrs. Calloway, purchased her supplies with steady hands, and walked home. She told Paul that evening, factually and without embellishment. He listened with his jaw tight and his eyes very quiet, which she had come to understand was the exterior of a man who was angry with considerable control. "He said those things about you," Paul said. "He said things about both of us," Esther said. "About the arrangement, about my character." "Your character is beyond any reproach that Harlan Greer is capable of offering," Paul said. "The man is a drunk who could not make a legitimate claim on a stick of furniture." "I know," she said. "I'm not distressed about the things he said. I'm telling you because you should know and because I think it means he's going to try something else." Paul was quiet for a moment. "I think you're right." He looked at her across the table. "Esther, I want to ask you something. I want to ask you now because I don't want the asking to look like a reaction to Harlan Greer or to anything that needs defending. I want it to be entirely clear that I am asking because I want to and for no other reason." She waited. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not as an arrangement, not for practical reasons. Because I love you and I want you to have every right and every standing that being my wife would give you, and because I think we could be very good to each other for a long time." Esther Alden, who had not felt at home since childhood until this kitchen, looked at Paul Blackwell and thought of the 8-year-old girl she had been in Virginia, standing in her mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning with the smell of apple and cinnamon in the air, before the world had stopped being safe. She thought of the 17 years between that morning and this one. She thought of all the provisional places and all the careful distances and all the love she had not allowed herself because she had not trusted any ground to hold it. The ground here was holding it. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." He stood up and came around the table to her, and when he took her hands and pulled her to her feet and held her, she put her face against his chest and let herself be held without reservation for the first time since she was a child, and the particular terror and relief of that openness was almost more than she could stand. "I've got you," he said quietly, which was not a romantic phrase but was the truest, most necessary thing anyone had said to her in 17 years. They were married on the first Saturday of December, 1878, in the framed church at the north end of Front Street. The minister was a Reverend Josiah Holt, a thin man with unexpectedly warm eyes who had been serving the Hayes City congregation for 4 years. The witnesses were Amos Greer and Mrs. Halloran, who had kept Esther's room during the first weeks and had since become something like a friend. The day was cold and bright, and the sky was the particular hard blue of the Kansas winter, and Esther wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had made herself in Philadelphia, and which was, she thought, the right color for a woman who had decided to stop being gray about everything. Paul wore a dark coat and a clean white shirt and looked at her when she came through the church door with an expression that was simple and complete, and that she understood immediately and perfectly. They exchanged their vows in plain language. No elaborate ceremony. What Paul said to her, when it was his turn, was, "I promise to know you honestly and to build alongside you, and to be the kind of person this life deserves." And what she said to him was, "I promise to stay and to let you stay and to stop being afraid of how much this matters." Reverend Holt pronounced them married with visible satisfaction, and Amos Greer shook Paul's hand firmly, and Mrs. Halloran kissed Esther on the cheek, and outside the church the hard blue sky held the entire cold, perfect day, and the prairie went on forever in every direction like a promise. They held a small supper at the house that evening, with Amos and the 2 hired hands and Mrs. Halloran and a neighbor couple named the Dentons who had a property half a mile north. Paul made a venison roast and Esther made bread and a dried apple cake, and there was music from a fiddle that one of the hired hands, a young man named Cody, had brought without being asked, and it was, Esther thought, watching the lamplit faces of the people around her kitchen table, the most genuinely domestic evening she could remember. The thing with Harlan Greer resolved itself, as ugly things sometimes do, through its own momentum. Harlan, having failed at the legal avenue, had made the mistake of continuing to drink and continue to talk in the saloon, and one of the things he talked about was the allegation that Paul Blackwell had arranged a false record to defeat a legitimate debt claim. This was the kind of allegation that, in a cattle town in 1878, where a man's word and his records were the foundation of all his business dealings, was treated with considerable seriousness. Edward Marsh heard about it, informed the county sheriff, and Harlan Greer found himself facing a charge of making false public allegations against a property holder's character. The matter was heard at the county seat in January, and Harlan was ordered to leave Ellis County and not return. He departed, and that particular dark chapter closed cleanly, and Amos Greer stood on the porch after hearing the news and looked out at the winter prairie with an expression of enormous, quiet relief. "I'm sorry for the trouble my family brought to your door," Amos said to Paul, and by extension to Esther. "Your family is not your fault," Esther said, which was the same thing Paul had said to him weeks before, and which was, she thought, a principle worth repeating. The winter was cold and close, and they were largely confined to the house for the hardest weeks of January and February, and this turned out to be among the most unexpected blessings of Esther's life. She had thought she might find the confinement difficult. She had spent 17 years keeping enough space around herself that she could breathe. But the house in the deep winter was not a trap. It was a world complete in itself. Paul had a significant collection of books, more than she had expected, and they read in the evenings by the fire, trading books back and forth with comments that became, over the weeks, one of the most satisfying kinds of conversation she had ever known. He was a reader the way she was a reader, not for escape but for the particular pleasure of a well-constructed idea, and they disagreed about things often and usefully and without rancor. She showed him in February that she had kept a journal since she was 12 years old, a practice she had never told anyone about, 17 years of small leather-bound books in a trunk under her bed. She did not show him the contents. She showed him the books themselves, the fact of them, the evidence that she had been recording her life continuously for nearly 2 decades even when the life had not felt worth recording. "Can I read them?" he asked in a tone that made it absolutely clear he would accept no without modification. "Not yet," she said. "Someday." He accepted that with a nod that was also a promise to wait, and she found that his willingness to wait for things she was not yet ready to offer was one of the things she loved most about him. In March, the snow broke and the world came back. Esther attacked the kitchen garden with the focused energy of someone who had been planning its restoration all winter, ordering seeds from a catalog that Callaway stocked, laying out what she wanted where in sketches she made in the kitchen on cold mornings. Paul watched these preparations with an attention that was, she had come to understand, his way of showing interest, not helping unsolicited but watching carefully, asking good questions, offering specific labor when labor was what was needed. He built her a cold frame for starting the seedlings. He built it without announcement, just appeared one morning with lumber and tools and constructed it on the south side of the house in an afternoon. She came out and looked at it when he was done and put her hand on the wood and said, "This is very good work." "I can build things," he said, with the small, contained satisfaction of a capable person being recognized for their capability. "I know," she said. It was spring when they had the first conversation about children. They were walking along the creek on a Sunday afternoon in April, the first genuinely warm day of the year, and the cottonwoods were doing the thing they did at that time of year where the light came through the new leaves and made everything look provisional and hopeful. Esther had been thinking about it for some time, in the private, careful way she approached things she was not sure how to raise. "Do you want children?" she asked. The directness was, she thought, the most honest approach. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I do. I have for a long time." He paused. "I think about the boy we lost. Clara and I think about what he might have been." She took his hand. "I think about whether I'm ready," she said honestly. "I did not have a mother past the age of 8. I'm not certain what I know about being one." "You know what you wanted from a mother," he said. "That seems like the place to start." She turned that over. "I wanted someone to stay," she said, "and to make things smell like home, and to be honest with me even when honesty was harder than comfort." "Those things," he said, "you already know how to do." She looked at the cottonwoods dropping their light on the water. She thought about the kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October and the smell that had broken her open and let something new in. She thought about staying and building and letting herself be held. "I want children," she said. "I want that very much." He squeezed her hand. "Good," he said. By the summer of 1879, Esther knew she was expecting. She had known for several weeks before she told Paul, not because she was keeping a secret, but because she needed the time to sit with it herself, to let the reality of it become real to her before she opened it to another person's emotions about it. This was a habit of hers that he understood and did not take personally. He had married a woman who processed inwardly before she spoke outwardly, and he honored it. She told him on a morning in late July when they were having breakfast, setting her coffee cup down and looking at him directly across the table and saying, "I believe I am carrying a child. I am probably 4 months along." His face went through several things rapidly. She watched them, the immediate joy, then the careful containment of it because he had learned to be careful about joy in matters of health, then the full warmth of it coming back through anyway because this was too large to contain. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Are you well?" he said first, which was the right question. "I feel well," she said, "better than I expected. I think I need to see the doctor to confirm it properly." "I'll take you today," he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Today I just wanted you to know." He came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and looked up at her with an expression she had no word for that was adequate to it, something made of love and relief and awe and the specific tenderness of a man who had wanted this and feared wanting it too much. "Esther," he said. "I know," she said. He put his forehead against her shoulder, and she put her hand in his hair, and they stayed like that in the July kitchen for a long, quiet moment. And outside the prairie was already hot and bright, and the cattle were moving somewhere in the middle distance, and somewhere close by a bird was making its summer noise, and everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. Dr. Raymond, who kept the practice on Front Street, confirmed her condition the next morning and estimated a December birth. He was a thorough, sensible man who gave her clear instructions and no panic, which was the kind of medical care she needed. She asked every question she had, and he answered them all, and she came out of the office feeling informed and capable, which was her preferred emotional state. The news traveled through Hayes City with the gentle speed of good news in small communities. Mrs. Halloran stopped her on the street and embraced her. Amos Greer shook Paul's hand for the second time with the same quiet force he had brought to the wedding. The Dentons brought a pie, which was the Western expression of all the things words could not adequately cover. Esther's pregnancy was largely uncomplicated, for which she was deeply grateful. The summer heat was difficult, but she had the kitchen garden to manage, which gave her productive activity without excessive strain, and she found that the physical work of growing things in the ground was deeply compatible with the physical work of growing something inside her. Both required patience. Both required the right conditions, carefully maintained. Both were fundamentally acts of faith. Paul was extraordinary during those months. Not in a hovering, anxious way that she would have found smothering, but in the specific, practical way of a man who had decided that her well-being was his primary consideration, and was going about that decision with his characteristic efficiency and attention. He took over the heavier work of the house without comment. He kept the firewood stocked before she could think to ask. He sat with her in the evenings with a particular kind of attentiveness that was not worry but watchfulness, the alert care of someone who was paying close attention so he could respond to anything that was needed. He also talked to her. This was something she had not fully expected. He was not a man who talked easily about the interior of things, but during those evenings, sitting on the porch in the fading summer and then into the cooling fall, he told her things she had not yet known. About his own childhood in Missouri, about the way his mother had been before her death, about the specific texture of the grief of losing a parent young, and how it shaped the way you held everything afterward. He was telling her, she understood, that he knew something of what she carried. Not the same thing, but something adjacent. And the gift of being known in that way, of having someone understand the topography of your wound, even if they had received their wound from a different source, was among the most profound comforts she had ever experienced. The fall came on in its full Kansas magnificence. Esther put up apple preserves in October, exactly 1 year after Paul had done it, and she had stood in the kitchen doorway undone by the smell. She made them from the same recipe he had used, which he found for her, written in his grandmother's hand on a piece of paper folded into an old almanac on the kitchen shelf. She made them on a Sunday morning, the cast iron pot on the stove, the cinnamon and brown sugar and dried apple filling the kitchen with the smell that had broken her open a year before. And this time the smell did not break her open because she was already open, already home. Paul came into the kitchen while she was stirring and stopped in the doorway, that thing he still did, standing in doorways, and she looked at him over her shoulder, and he looked back at her, very large with their child by now, standing at his stove in his kitchen making the recipe his grandmother had written down, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Their son was born on the 14th of December, 1879, on a cold, bright night with stars so large over the prairie that they seemed to be pressing against the windows. The labor was hard and long, and Esther went through it with the kind of focused, teeth-gritted determination that she brought to everything difficult. And when it was over and Dr. Raymond placed the boy in her arms, red-faced and furious and entirely, emphatically alive, she held him and looked at Paul, who was kneeling beside the bed with his hand on her hair, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. No careful containment, No measured control. Just pure, open, overwhelming love, the full weight of it visible in every line of his face. "He looks angry," Paul said softly. "He's newly arrived," Esther said. "He'll settle." They named him Thomas James Blackwell, Thomas for no specific ancestor, but because the name felt solid and real, James for Paul's father. Thomas was indeed furious for the first several weeks in the way of healthy, demanding newborns, and Esther navigated those weeks on very little sleep and considerable instinct, finding to her continuing surprise that the instincts were there, that the knowledge was there, that the love was so large it overrode the exhaustion and the uncertainty and the moments of pure terror that came with keeping a small human alive. Paul was the kind of father she should have known he would be. He was present and capable, and unafraid of the physical realities of infant care. He took Thomas in the nights without complaint, walking the length of the downstairs when the baby would not settle, and Esther could hear him through the ceiling, his quiet, measured voice talking to the infant about the ranch accounts or the state of the south pasture fence, which was apparently his default conversation topic when he was tired, and the absurdity of it made her laugh quietly into her pillow in the dark. Thomas settled, as she had predicted, and became by the spring of 1880 a baby of considerable personality and no small amount of charm. He had Paul's dark hair and what Mrs. Halloran insisted were Esther's eyes, though Esther could not see it herself. He was interested in everything and vocal about all of it, and the house that had been quiet in ways Paul had not always known how to navigate was quiet no longer. Their life in the years that followed was not without its difficulties. This was Kansas in the early 1880s, and the difficulties were real and various. There were years when the rains did not come, and the cattle operation strained under the pressure of a drying market. There was a summer in 1882 when a fever swept through the region, and Thomas, then 2 years old, was ill for a frightening week, and Esther did not sleep properly for the duration. There was a legal dispute over the eastern boundary of Paul's property, with a neighboring rancher that required another engagement with the county courts, and tested their patience considerably. These were things that happened in a life built on raw land in a young state, and they moved through each of them with the particular resilience of people who had already survived their hardest things before they ever met each other. But there were also the good years in their full abundance, which is what Esther remembered when she looked back and tried to account for the shape of her life. The kitchen garden became something genuinely remarkable by 1882. What had started as her restoration project became a productive, organized kitchen garden that supplied the house through the summer and fall, and provided enough surplus to contribute to what was becoming an informal network of exchange among the women of Hays City, trading vegetables for other goods and services. Mrs. Halloran took preserves. The Dentons took herbs. A new family named the Praters, who had arrived from Ohio in 1881 with 4 children and very little, received vegetables without any exchange required, because Esther had been given charity once and she knew its value. She had written in her journal through all of it, through the first months of careful, provisional living, through the Tuesday in October when the kitchen undid her, through the proposal and the wedding and the pregnancy and Thomas's birth and the fever and the boundary dispute and the good years and the difficult ones. All of it in the small leather books, 17 old ones carried from Philadelphia, and then new ones, Kansas ones, filled with the ongoing record of a life that had finally settled somewhere worth recording. In the spring of 1883 she showed Paul the journals, not all of them, but the Kansas ones, the ones that began with her arrival on the train platform and contained the truth of everything since. She left them on the kitchen table one morning and told him they were there if he wanted them, and then went out to the garden. He read them that day. She came in at noon and he was still at the table. She went out again at 2. When she finally came in for the afternoon, he was sitting with the last book closed in front of him, and his expression was something she had never quite seen on his face before, not in 5 years of knowing him. "Esther," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did not know," he said. "I knew about the surface of it, but I did not know what it cost you, all of it. The 17 years, coming here, deciding to stay." "I know," she said. "I wasn't ready to show you until I was sure it was safe to." "Is it safe?" he said. She sat down across from him, where she had sat on the first morning in October when the smell broke her open, and he had simply told her to come in and sit down. She looked at him across the table that they had eaten at together for 5 years, in the kitchen that smelled like her mother's, in the house that had become the first place she had felt like herself since childhood. "Yes," she said, "completely." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you for trusting me with it. Thank you for making it safe too," she said. In the fall of 1883, she knew she was expecting again. She told him sooner this time, 2 months in rather than 4, because the careful privacy of the first time had been about protecting herself from a hope she was not yet sure she could trust, and she was past needing that particular protection. He heard it and smiled immediately, the full smile that she had learned to love, the one that reached his eyes without any control in the way. "Another December baby," he said, looking at her in the calculating way that meant he was doing calendar arithmetic. "Probably March," she said. Their second child arrived in March of 1884, on a day when the Kansas spring was trying its best after a long winter, and this time it went faster, which the doctor said was to be expected, and which Esther experienced as a mercy. The baby was a girl, small and determined, and from the first hour of her life utterly certain about what she wanted, which was food, warmth, and her mother in that order. Paul held her in the late afternoon light by the bedroom window and looked at his daughter with the same unguarded love he had brought to Thomas 4 years before, and Thomas himself, now a serious and curious 4-year-old who had been waiting in the kitchen with Amos Greer for the past several hours, was brought up to meet her with enormous solemnity and stared at her for a long time before declaring her interesting. They named her Clara Esther Blackwell. The Clara was not obligatory. It was an offering freely made, the acknowledgement of someone who had been loved and lost, and who had left behind a row of marigolds and a house with good bones. The Esther was Paul's idea. "She gets to carry your name," he said simply, when they were discussing it. "That seems right." With Clara came a new season of the life, a busier one in some ways and in others more deeply rooted than ever. Thomas was loud and energetic and devoted to his father with the particular fervor of small boys who have decided their fathers are the most interesting person in their world. Clara was quieter and more observant, and she spent her infant months watching everything with dark, serious eyes that eventually lightened to a hazel that was entirely her own. The house was full in ways it had not been before, full of noise and motion, and the particular kind of abundant chaos that well-loved children create, and Esther moved through it with a competence and warmth that she had not known she possessed until it was called upon. She continued her journal. She had now filled 6 Kansas books. In the pages of those books was everything: the smell of the kitchen on a Tuesday in October, the marigolds in the garden that had survived Clara Blackwell's absence, Paul reading in the firelight in January, Thomas's first words, which had been emphatic and related to wanting to be outdoors. The day she had shown Paul the journals and said, "Yes, completely, this is safe." The small accumulated days that were the actual substance of a life that could not be summarized or reduced and did not need to be. She also wrote, in the summer of 1884, a letter to her own past self. She had not planned to do this. She had been writing in the journal one evening after the children were asleep, and Paul was reading across the table, and she had thought of the 8-year-old girl in Virginia and the specific quality of her loss, the way the world had gone from safe to provisional in the space of a single season, and she had written to her directly. She wrote, "You have been running from the smell of your mother's kitchen because you could not stand how much it reminded you of what you had lost. But I want to tell you that it will find you again. It will find you in a kitchen in Kansas on a Tuesday in October when you are 25 years old, and a man you barely know yet will be stirring preserves at a cast iron stove, and the smell will break you open, and that breaking open will be the best thing that ever happens to you. You will cry in front of a stranger, and he will let you, and he will tell you to come in and sit down, and you will stay. You will find out what staying feels like. You will find out what home feels like after a very long time without one. You will find out that love is not a romantic thing for foolish people. It is a practical thing for brave people, and you are brave even when you do not know it. She closed the journal. Paul looked up from his book. The lamp between them was warm, and the house was quiet, and the children were asleep overhead, and outside the Kansas summer was making its large, dark, warm presence known. "All right," he said. "Very all right," she said. "I was just thinking about," she looked at him, "this man who had left her a note on a train platform saying he was sorry for the poor welcome, who had arranged a horse because she had mentioned once that she could ride, who had let her cry in his kitchen without fuss and told her to come in and sit down, who had built her a cold frame without announcement and named their daughter after her and read her journals with the kind of attention that was the highest form of respect she could imagine. About how this is the life I am actually living," she said, "and how that is remarkable." He set down his book. "You thought it might not be this life." "I thought," she said carefully, "that I might always be the person who was almost somewhere, almost settled, almost home. I did not think I was capable of fully arriving." He was quiet for a moment. "And now," she looked around the kitchen, the cast iron stove, the shelves running the length of the south wall, the window over the sink where the October light had laid itself in a stripe across the floor on a morning that had changed everything, the table where they ate and talked and argued about books and made decisions about the ranch and raised their children and held each other's hands through the difficult things and said the true things out loud because they had both learned hard and late that the true things needed to be said. "I have arrived," she said. "I am fully here. This is my home." He smiled, and it was the full one, the real one, the one with no control in it. "You always were," he said. "I think you just needed a minute." 17 years, she said. "A long minute," he agreed. She laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that came from something genuinely light rather than social obligation, the kind she had discovered she was capable of somewhere in the first year in Kansas when Paul had said something dry and unexpected at the dinner table, and she had laughed and surprised herself with it. She still occasionally surprised herself. She thought she might always. This seemed on balance like a very good thing. The years continued to add themselves, the way years do when a life is going right, without dramatic announcement, just the steady accumulation of seasons and harvests and winters and springs, of Thomas growing tall and serious, and developing his father's particular way of standing in doorways and thinking before he spoke, of Clara growing into the observant, stubborn, brilliant person she had clearly been intending to become since birth. In the spring of 1887 they had a third child, a boy they named Samuel John Blackwell, who arrived in May like everything in May, energetically and with considerable warmth. Samuel was the noisiest of the three, and the most immediately social, and by the time he was 2 years old he had formed strong opinions about everything and communicated them at full volume, which Thomas found exasperating and Clara found hilarious. The house expanded in 1888, Paul adding 2 rooms to the east side, which Esther had been managing the logistics of for the better part of 2 years before he agreed it was necessary. He was careful about spending, always had been, the habit of the man who had arrived with $47 and built everything from it. But the 3 children had made the original structure genuinely insufficient, and Esther's argument was thorough and well documented, which was always the most effective way to convince Paul Blackwell of anything. He built the new rooms himself, with help from Amos and the hired men, over the summer. Esther managed the household around the construction with the organizational fluency she had developed over 10 years of running a working ranch house, and when it was done, She stood in the doorway of the larger of the two new rooms and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who has planned something and seen it through. "Well," Paul said, coming to stand behind her. "It's exactly what I said it needed to be," she said. "Of course it is," he said. "You planned it." She turned around and looked at him. He was 41 years old, this man she had married, and the decade of their life together was written in his face in ways she found deeply satisfying to read. The sun lines had deepened and his hair was beginning to go gray at the temples, and there was something settled and sure in the way he held himself that had not always been there, or perhaps had always been there, and she simply knew how to read it now. 10 years, she said. "Not quite," he said. "November. You're counting." "I'm always counting," he said. "I'm an extremely practical man." She laughed and he reached for her hand, and they stood in the doorway of the new room together, exactly as they had stood in doorways throughout their life, and the house around them was full of the sounds of their children somewhere in its other rooms. And outside, the summer prairie was going on in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful way. And the kitchen still smelled like her mother's every October when the preserves went up, and it always would, and she was home. They celebrated their 10th anniversary in November of 1888 with a supper that Esther cooked over 2 days, a genuine feast by frontier standards, roast beef and bread, and 3 kinds of vegetables from the root cellar, and a cake with dried fruit that she had been planning since September. The guests were Amos and the Dentons and Mrs. Halloran, who had been at every significant event of their married life, and who had become something Esther thought of as family in the only way that mattered, which was continuous loving presence rather than blood. Paul gave her a gift that evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed. It was a new journal, leather-bound and larger than the one she had been using, the kind made by a bookbinder in Ellsworth that she had admired once in passing in a way she thought he had not noticed. He had ordered it months ago. "For the next 10 years, he said. She held it and ran her hand over the cover. "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, with no self-congratulation in it, and that was why it landed the way it did, heavy with the truth of 10 years of being genuinely known. She opened the first page and wrote, in the careful, clear hand she had always had, the date and the words, "I am home. I have been home for 10 years. I intend to be home for 40 more." She showed it to him and he read it and nodded once, the nod that meant he was moved by something and was moving through it quietly. 40 more, he said. "Minimum," she said. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the first time and everything like it too, the same attention and intention, the same feeling of not doing things halfway, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was after 10 years a very great deal, an abundance of the particular love that grows between people who have chosen each other in the full knowledge of what they are choosing, and have found the choice to be worthy of everything it cost. Thomas was 9 by then, and Clara 5, and Samuel was a howling, glorious 3-year-old who required the constant benign supervision of everyone in the house, and the life was full in every possible direction, and the ranch was producing well in a good cattle year, and Amos Greer was still the most reliable foreman in Ellis County, and the kitchen garden had been producing for 9 growing seasons and had grown into something that Esther's mother, had she lived to see it, would have recognized as the work of someone who understood how a garden and a home and a life were all made the same way, with patience and attention, and the willingness to return to the work even in the years when the return felt uncertain. And every October, without fail, the kitchen smelled like a Sunday morning in Virginia when the world had been soft and her mother had been alive, and the apple preserves had been in the cast iron pot on the stove. It smelled like the kitchen she had stood in the doorway of on a Tuesday morning in 1878 and nearly buckled from the weight of recognition. It smelled like the first morning she had let herself cry in front of Paul Blackwell, who had let her cry and then said, "Come in and sit down," and who had been saying that in 100 different ways ever since. She had not felt at home since childhood until his kitchen smelled like her mama's on a Sunday. And then she had come home and stayed. On a Sunday morning in October of 1889, 11 years after that first Tuesday, Esther stood at the stove and stirred the apple preserves while the October light came through the window and laid itself across the floor in the way it had always done. Thomas was in the barn helping Amos with the morning work, the way he spent every morning now, attached to Amos with the devotion of a child who had found his calling in the work of horses and cattle. Clara was at the kitchen table behind her, working through the arithmetic problems that Esther set for her every Saturday, because the nearest schoolteacher was 5 miles away, and Esther had determined long ago that her daughter's education was not going to be limited by geography. Samuel was somewhere between the kitchen and the back porch, in the perpetual motion of a 4-year-old who had decided that standing still was a waste of a perfectly good morning. Paul came in from outside with the particular sound of his boots she had memorized over 11 years, the deliberate, unhurried rhythm she had heard for the first time on the stairs at Mrs. Halloran's boarding house when he came to call at 9 o'clock the morning after she arrived. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She looked at him over her shoulder. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and brown sugar and dried apple and wood smoke, and Clara was working through her arithmetic at the table, and Samuel had appeared at Paul's feet and was attempting to climb his leg, and Thomas was somewhere in the barn being exactly who he was going to be, and the October light was doing its particular thing on the kitchen floor. Paul looked at his wife and his daughter and his smallest child attempting to scale him like a fence post, and at the kitchen that smelled like her mother's on a Sunday, and at the life they had built in the exact center of everything that mattered, and the expression on his face was the same one she had first seen on their wedding day, the full and open one with nothing held back. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Samuel succeeded in reaching his father's hip and hung there triumphantly. Clara muttered something about fractions without looking up. The preserves sent their cinnamon smoke through every room. And Esther Alden Blackwell turned back to the stove and stirred and was home, and the morning went on, and the life went on, and it was exactly enough, and it was everything.